strange, bewildering time. Istanbul to Kathmandu in the last year of the Hippie Trail. In the spring of 1978, Mark Abley put aside his studies at Oxford and set off on a 3-month trek across the celebrated Hippie Trail. He lived to tell the tale in a fascinating new book called Strange, Bewildering Time. Delighted to be joining me, the author, Mark Abley himself. Mark, good afternoon from us. Good morning to you.
Good afternoon, Giles.
Whereabouts are you on the planet today, sir?
I am in suburban Montreal, where it's actually 4 degrees above zero, which is incredibly balmy for a Montreal February, but I guess not quite so much for Spain in February.
Well, you would be surprised and delighted to know it's absolutely freezing, but nothing like it is over there in Canada at the moment. We're shivering a bit. It's an interesting one, isn't it? The book you've written, because it is, if you like, 78 is the last year of the Hippie Trail, because everything kind of changes, not only with the Hippie Trail, but the world kind of changes, and we slam into the 80s.
Yeah, that's right. And in particular, what happened in Asia that made this sort of mass movement of hundreds of thousands of young Westerners impossible to do was, first of all, the Afghan borders closed down. We were actually in Iran when a Marxist coup happened in May 1978, and the borders closed, so we couldn't get into Afghanistan. And then several months after that, the Iranian Revolution happened, and Iran closed its borders to Western travelers. So, of course, young people can still get to India and Thailand and so on. But now it's very unusual for them to go overland, as I did, by bus, local bus and local train.
So what was it was obviously incredibly popular amongst sort of a certain segment of young students. Was it sort of an idealistic thing? Everybody was listening to Led Zeppelin, Kashmir, and thought this is going to be, just me and a few bags and a few sort of bells on my shoes, and off I go to discover enlightenment? I mean, was that the kind of ideal?
Well, up to a point, but it's very funny you should mention that song, because Led Zeppelin, because they had not actually been to Kashmir, right? Robert Plant had written the lyrics to Kashmir in Morocco, which is why if you listen to Kashmir, you'll hear that he's singing about a desert with the singer's eyes filling with sand as he scans a wasted land. Doesn't sound like Kashmir at all. And there was a lot of things that the young people at the time kind of got wrong, including the musicians. So when I get to the start of my chapter about Nepal, I mentioned that Janis Joplin sang about Kathmandu. The American rocker Bob Seger had a song called Kathmandu,
yep.
And the title Strange Bewildering Time comes from a wonderful song by Cat Stevens called Kathmandu. None of them had ever been to Kathmandu.
But strangely enough, I mean, Cat Stevens, who would soon become Yusuf, maybe had a better idea than Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band.
He certainly did, yeah. Cat Stevens really caught something of the sort of idealistic questing spirit of the time. Some of it was bound up with the easy availability of drugs, but there was a real sense of idealism as well, and of wanting to discover the world, and that came with a certain sense of privilege as well, because after all, those of us who were lucky enough to make the trip, we had the money to do so, and most of the people in the countries we were traveling through did not have the money or the time.
So tell me exactly sort of how it operated, because it seems like quite an undertaking. This is before cheap flights. It's before WhatsApping, social media, that sort of thing. So, you were gone, for a while.
We were completely out of touch with everyone we loved, because there were no smartphones either. And the only maps we had were fold-out maps. So what happened was that a lot of people would get on a bus in either London or Amsterdam. There were several bus companies, Magic Bus, Top Deck, Budget Bus, and others. And then would travel to Istanbul fairly quickly, and then more slowly often after that. Claire and I, the young English woman I was traveling with, Claire and I did it a bit differently. We decided to go local buses and trains all the way. So we went across Turkey, through Iran down into southeastern Iran. Then we got a smuggler's train from Iran into Pakistan, went up through Pakistan, crossed the Khyber Pass, then into India, up to Kashmir, across northern India, and to Nepal. Some people also went to Sri Lanka. We didn't get that far. The furthest we got was the Tibetan border.
So how did you... Hopefully, you planned this one out. Was it all maps and drop-off points? I mean, you didn't just get on the magic bus at Victoria Station and say, have some of these and off we go, and everybody's going to be friendly and nothing could possibly happen to two young Westerners in a foreign land?
Unlike a lot of people at the time, we improvised, we adapted, we had a sort of confidence that things would work out well. And on the whole, they did, although there were certainly some pretty rough points. But we had return tickets from Delhi to fly back to London. So we had that as the deadline. Otherwise, if we stayed 4 days in Kashmir or 6 or 8, we had no idea. We decided to go to Jaipur in Rajasthan. We didn't know we were going to do that until we got to Delhi. A lot of the trip was improvised. And that was absolutely standard and normal, that nothing was mapped out in advance the way it is for most people traveling today.
And was it how you imagined it would be? Because you go from the first, from Europe into the third world. I mean, real poverty, real eye opener. Yeah. And was that at that point you realised, hang on a second, I'm doing this from university. I've had a pretty privileged, sheltered upbringing. Did the reality come crashing in then when you actually got into the areas?
Yeah, it certainly did. And, I was thinking that there would be beautiful architectural sites to see, mosques and temples and so on, and indeed there were. But I backpacked around Europe and around Britain, and so I was not an inexperienced traveler, but I'd never been in a poor country. So it was the smell, it was the sound, the volume of noise, it was the overwhelming sort of sense impressions that really stood out. And I became very tired because, it wasn't a relaxing trip. It was an incredible trip. I learned so much, but it was not a relaxing trip in the very least.
Because I think people thought they were going to go out and have pretty much like, the Beatles in India, but that was all carefully choreographed and people looking after them. But if you are thundering across the country with a backpack and, you're looking for somewhere to stay and you're getting hassled all the time, as you said, the sights and the smells, can be quite an overload.
Well, there was one train in particular that in northern India, it was called the Janata Express, which means People's Express. It was indeed for the people, but it was anything but an express. This compartment of the train we were on would have seated 8. There were 4 compartments, so it would have seated 32. There must have been at least 90, maybe 100 people crammed into that. We couldn't get to the toilet. We couldn't get any food or drink. The only way we could get out of the train when we got to the next station was to toss our backpacks out of the window and clamber out of the window. So that was an eye-opener. That was like nothing I'd experienced on British Railways.
You obviously hadn't travelled to sort of Leeds late at night, but the thing is, I mean, this may sound a bit sort of pompous, but were people friendly, or were they like, because there weren't an awful lot of people doing the Hippie Trail. It's not like you go to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia now, or any of these regions, and obviously, dread word, the influences will probably run into you.
Yeah, I mean, it varied. And I have to say that the country where we were met with the greatest kindness was Iran, which is not what you would expect, from reading the news or anything now. But in Iran, people were so gracious, so hospitable, so friendly. It was really amazing. Now, I was traveling with a young English woman, and she took care to dress pretty modestly. She wasn't there in halter tops and bikinis. But even so, she was sexually harassed in Turkey and again in Pakistan and India. So that made it more difficult for her than it was for me. But overall, if you took some precautions, there was still a lot of friendliness. So even in the places where, we had to be pretty careful, we were met with a lot of warmth. We just had to be careful to show some respect for the local cultures.
It's interesting you mention Iran, because after the revolution, a lot of Iranians who could flee came to southern Spain, and I was fortunate enough I was at school with quite a few Persians, and their hospitality is legendary. And there is something quite sad when you hear people basically saying, "Oh, the Iranians, they're all this, that, and the other." It's like, no, they're not. They're a wonderful, hospitable, cultured bunch of people who just have this insane government.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the insane government is kind of a result of a really, I would say pretty repressive government that was there before. I mean, it wasn't like the Islamic regime that's in power now, but the Shah's regime was pretty brutal, and I think that's one reason why Iran ended up with the kind of a government it has now, is that young people who were not by any means militant Islamists, they turned to the mullahs, they turned to the ayatollahs, because they were the only people who were resisting the Shah. But that's all at a kind of political level, just a very personal level. Like I said, we were, there was one time when we were walking along a country road, and some young Iranians went out of their way to pick us up in their car and take us to this archaeological site we wanted to get to. And then on the way back, another car stopped. This turned out to be an engineer and his wife and their small son. And not only did they go out of their way to take us back to our hotel, they also stopped for a picnic along the way and shared their food with us. And I found myself thinking, would I have done the same in Canada or England? Would I have done the same for a couple of young Asians traveling in my country? And I had to admit the answer is no way.
Yeah, it's those small acts of hospitality and kindness that make you stop and think and go, hang on a second, who is the not more civilized, but you know what I mean? Because people go to that part of the world thinking, oh well, I'm far superior, and yet the etiquette of hospitality, of treating a stranger as a guest has long been kind of lost over here.
Yeah, totally. And if I think about what I remember, I mean, I don't really remember the Red Fort in Delhi very well, although it's a magnificent building and we did see it. But I remember the personal encounters we had with people in India much more than I remember the architectural marvels.
One of the things you did, I believe, is you kept journals whilst you were traveling on buses.
Yeah, absolutely, because I was determined I was going to be a hotshot young poet, and I thought these journals would provide images for poems. Then eventually I realized I was never going to be a particularly good poet, but I still had the journals. So that's what made it possible to write this book 45 years later, was the fact that I had the very detailed journals to stir my memories.
And I mean, going back to those must have been quite something, because obviously not only about the locations, but the way you looked at the world, 45 years ago.
Yeah, I was high-minded and probably a bit pompous, and so I'm not altogether fond of the young man I was. But what interests me is to see that young man, to see my younger self developing qualities of patience and resilience, toughness, really, that I don't think I had when I set out from Oxford. I was 22. I set out from Oxford. I'd had a great education and so on. I was very lucky, but I didn't have the kind of toughness that comes with spending 36 hours sitting on window seats, sitting on a wooden seat, looking out the window as the train made its way with infinite slowness through the desert of southwestern Pakistan. That really teaches you something that all the tutorials at Oxford can't do.
I suppose as well, I mean, travel, as we know, broadens the mind, but also the experience, but also it has to be the right kind of travel. And people who just leap on a plane and you go to Bali and take a few selfies and come back haven't really experienced that. And that won't, that if you go to a foreign country and see it as a number of photo ops, then you're never going to have the experience that you had, taking it very slowly, not through choice, but just through the method of travel, on your journey.
That's right. And, Giles, I mean, I'm very proud of my daughter who's in her 20s. And a couple of years ago, she and her boyfriend made a 3-month trip through Central America, down as far as Colombia, heading out from Mexico. And they traveled in the same kind of way that I did. And they got to experience Latin America in a way that I never have, and in a way that I couldn't now, because, now that I'm well into my 60s, there's no way I could, experience the Asia the same way that I did back then. But I'm so glad that I had the chance to do that, and it put me in touch with local people and cultures in a way that means so much to me now.
And what do you hope that people will take from Strange, Bewildering Time?
A sense of wonder, I suppose, a sense of discovery, insofar as I can impart that. There's a limit to what any book can do, but if I look at travel shows on TV, I'm always struck by how sort of two-dimensional they are. You see the beautiful images of castles and churches and one thing and another, but you don't really get the full sensory experience. So that's what I've tried to do in this book, was to, as much as possible, show people what it was like to hear Asia coming at me, and to smell Asia, in a good as well as a bad way, and to taste Asia, and really to have the full frontal experience of other cultures and a very different time. I don't feel nostalgic for everything about the trip, but I do feel nostalgic for that particular time and the possibilities of travel that were open to me in 1978 and are not so much open to people now.
Because the world has changed so much, and as you said, shortly after the revolution around what happened in Afghanistan, you must look at the world news and go, yeah, I was there and I remember it, and it gives you a different perspective on the events.
It does. It really does. And and it's sad to say, when I look at images of Turkey now, I think of the what I experienced in eastern Turkey, and some of that, destroyed in the earthquake.
Also, just a final question, because you're now in Montreal. You spent time in the UK. You went all over on this trail. The idea of home as being, do you see that as a geographical place, or is it within yourself? It's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, for me it was always tricky, because I was born in England of English parents, and I married an English woman, or she would say a Welsh woman now, in fact, because Wales has become very important to her.
Indeed.
And so I've always had a dual sense of home between Canada and Britain, but I think we all make our sense of home. I mean, home is not just a particular building or a particular city. It's people. It's where we feel we can be who we truly are, and so it's more edgy, it's more provisional.
The book is called Strange Bewildering Time, Istanbul to Kathmandu in the last year of the Hippie Trail. It's by Mark Abley. Mark, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Where can people, in the nicest possible way, discover you?
Absolutely. It's markabley.com, markabley.com.
You'll be able to find him. Mark Abley, my apologies, .com. The book is called Strange Bewildering Time. It'll also be available as a virtual download from our own virtual bookstore. Mark, thank you so much for your time today.
Great talking to you, Giles. Thank you.